We also have with us the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry. Rick Perry. There must be a Texan in the crowd. Rick Perry, unless I'm wrong, I think you were not only the governor of Texas, but the longest serving governor of Texas in Texas history, right?
That's a good thing.
Also a veteran of the Air Force, something I like, a cotton farmer. Rick says a cotton farmer, being a cotton farmer got him into politics. He wanted an easier job.
Very true.
And now is of course serving as our Secretary of Energy. They're both going to make a few comments, and then hopefully we've got time for a few questions and answers in these two absolutely critical cabinet positions. So, Secretary Perry, why don't you start off, tell us what's going on at Energy.
Bob, thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege to be back in front of CPAC. You all are the heart and soul of the conservative movement in this country, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Just a foot soldier in the Army, so to speak, and being on the stage with Ryan Zinke and his service to this country is again, he continues to give back to this country with his leadership, and we kind of go back and forth with each other about who has the most energy, and I'm not talking about personally, but in the country. And so he's got the public lands, I basically have the private lands, and the world has changed so much in the last decade. When you think about energy, where we find ourselves in the world, you know, you go back in the 70s when Jimmy Carter stood before the American people and talked about the malaise that was in this country, the long lines, and then you go forward for 30 more years, and this country found itself to be beholding to a lot of energy sources around the world that didn't necessarily have our best interest in mind. And the way that the government all too often dealt with energy was through regulation. And something interesting happened. The private sector, George Mitchell, a pioneer from my home state, who believed that he knew how to be able to extract this energy from some formations that people didn't think could occur, and America became energy independent. We became in such a powerful position. Today, the United States of America is the #1 oil and gas producing country in the world. And it didn't happen because government regulations. It happened because government basically got out of the way in some cases and allowed the private sector to go out there and do what the private sector does, is to risk. We've got a Secretary of Interior that understands that those resources on our public lands are incredibly important. And to safely and thoughtfully be able to do that puts America in a geopolitical position to be able to, we don't just export American LNG around the world. We export freedom. And you think about what that means around the world, that people, our allies, people who we want to be our allies, now know that because of American energy coming to their shores, they are free from countries that would put those values that those countries have in jeopardy. And because of American ingenuity, because of American energy independence, because of an administration that truly believes in freedom and exporting freedom around the world, that I think is the extraordinary story of the second decade of the 21st century. I'm proud to be a part of that and to be leading an agency that has fascinating things we're going to be talking about here this morning. The energy front is incredibly important, and we also do some other things together, but
we do.
I'll pass this back to you. And
give it up for the Secretary of Energy.
Thank you.
Secretary Zinke, tell us what's going on at Interior.
Well, on energy, why is energy important to us? One, environmentally, nobody does it better than the U.S. We have a regulatory framework that ensures accountability. No one does it better than the United States. And if you want to see how not to produce energy, I invite you to go to the Middle East or Africa. That's where the problems are. They're not in the United States. Secondly, economically. We talk about the tax bill, and does everyone like the tax bill that Donald Trump? Woo-hoo! Well, as good as the tax bill is, when America pulls up to a pump and they fill their car up every time they fill up, under the previous administration, it was $2, $4, $6, $100 to fill a car. American Energy has delivered, now it's $60. And that's $40 you have in your pocket, every American you would fill up to a pump station, that you wouldn't have. So America's economy is run on made in America energy, and it should be.
Yeah.
Thirdly, I spent 23 years in the SEALs, and morally, I never want your kids to ever see what I've seen. Ever. And a lot of it is, fracking has made such a big difference in getting the regulation out of the way. But I don't want ever to be held hostage by a foreign country, which is important. But also, I don't want our kids to have to fight on foreign shores for energy we have here. So I think three ways. So again, environmentally, it is better to produce energy here under reasonable regulation than watch it get produced overseas with none. Secondly, it's an economy driver, having the ability to produce energy here in this country. And the numbers will show you, we produce today about 10.3 million barrels a day in this country. And for the first time in 60 years, we're a net exporter of liquid natural gas. And that's President Donald Trump. So, Interior, we spent a lot last year, looking at the president's executive order. He said energy dominance, and that's what we're delivering to America and the world. And lastly, this coming year is going to be a pivot. As we're about to enter, our public lands, Interior, 1/5 the territory falls into the Interior, 12 time zones stretching from the Virgin Islands all the way out to Palau. But we're going to embark on what's called Mission 26. It's the largest investment in our public lands and park system in the history of this country. And it's going to be funded from energy, because if you're going to have energy on public lands, produce it, wind, solar, and I'm all the above.
Amen.
To me, it doesn't matter. As long as it's made in America, I'm good with it. But if you're going to make energy from or produce energy from Americans' public lands, then I think you should invest in our public lands, because we have the greatest assets on the face of the planet.
Secretary Zinke, let me stay with you for just a minute. At Interior, for a long, long time, we've had a philosophy in this country of land of many uses. I think it started with Teddy Roosevelt. The Obama administration, it seemed to me, turned that into a land of no uses. They used the designation of wilderness and national monuments as a weapon to actually close off a lot of our public lands to use by the people and use of the natural resources. Expand a little bit. You touched on it, but expand a little bit about what's the philosophy of not only yourself, but importantly this president, this administration.
Well, public lands belong to the people and not special interests, first and foremost. And, I tell a story about Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, for a lot of reasons, it really pushed this country on what we have today, a legacy of our public lands. And everyone loves our parks, and we like to go out there. We like making sure that we are great stewards. But Roosevelt went out to Yosemite and met a gentleman by the name of John Muir. And John Muir, a great naturalist. So he met Muir, and Muir spent a lot of time putting flowers in Roosevelt's pockets. And they went on a wonderful ride together in Yosemite, a ride, by the way, you could not replicate today because there's too much dead and dying timber. So Roosevelt comes back to Washington, and he hires a guy by the name of Gifford Pinchot. In Pinchot, there's a difference. Meeting Mayor, hiring Pinchot, and Pinchot really authored the American conservation ethic, which is best science, best practices, greatest good, longest term. That's the philosophy of multiple use. You can have our public land have multiple use in the long term. You can create wealth from our land, but you have to be good stewards. And in Interior, I'm the steward of our greatest holdings, but I'm also a steward of recreation, hunting, fishing, to make sure the public itself, we Americans, we should enjoy our public lands, and we should not be locked out of them.
Well said. Well said. Secretary Perry, you invoked Jimmy Carter's famous address to the nation about energy, or about no energy. I've actually got the quote. This happened just over 40 years ago. He said, at the current rate of consumption, we could, this is the quote, could use, this was in 1977, folks. Some of you weren't born in 1977, I was. At the current rate of consumption, we could use up all the proven reserves of oil in the entire world by the end of the next decade. So by sometime in the 1980s, we were supposed to be out of oil and gas. Yeah. Expand a little bit on what's changed so dramatically, and how much do we really have left if we know?
And I think that's the real key. And to ever draw that line and say, this is what we know and there's nothing else to know is a big mistake. We've seen it happen a lot of times in the past. In the early 2000s, many of you may have seen a fellow who traveled around the country, and he gave a speech that was titled Peak Oil, that we had found all the oil. It was kind of adding on to the Jimmy Carter story, if you will, that you could not retrieve any more of the natural resource. There were a few people in this country that didn't buy into that. George Mitchell, that I mentioned earlier, was one of them. And here's the difference between the Jimmy Carter mentality, the previous administration's mentality to some degree, and the current place we find ourselves in, the Trump administration mentality. And it's the difference between innovation and regulation. I happen to believe that if you will allow Americans to innovate, if you will give them the freedom, if you will give them the incentive to be innovators, that they'll find the challenges, they'll find the answer to the challenges, rather, that we face as a humanity. If we fall into the camp of we're just going to regulate, then we're in trouble. The great news is that the conservative movement in this country, what's happening in energy today is a confirmation of the conservative movement, in my opinion. That it's the don't allow government to regulate everything. Government's not the answer to every challenge that we have. And if we're going to rely upon government, we're going to have a life that's not as fulfilled. We're going to have a country that's not as powerful and as forward-leaning as we have today. Because there were innovators that did not believe government. Today, freedom is being exported around the world with American energy. That is good for the world. That is good for the United States. And I will suggest to you it's good for the future.
Absolutely. I think what I heard you say is it really addresses the rhetorical question: do you trust in people or do you trust in government?
Yeah. Listen, government's got a role, and conservatives believe in finding that balance. Sometimes our friends on the left just believe that government is the be-all, the end-all. You let us control everything and we'll deliver to you a better future. Conservatives don't believe that. Conservatives believe government's got a role out there. You need to play a role, certainly in keeping America free in the military and those types of things. We've got a role to play in balancing the regulations, if you will. This president and this administration, what he has done on the regulatory side is nothing less than world-changing. This administration being able to remove the regulations, still protecting our environment, still protecting the things that need to be protected, but freeing up and giving stability and predictability to those that are wanting to risk their capital. Nothing that we did in the state of Texas during the early 2000s, when we saw an incredible explosion economically, job-wise, affected more by regulatory stability and predictability. When you add the tax bill that the president has now passed to the regulatory restraint, that is how you change this country forever, and that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing. Changing this country forever in a very powerful and a positive way.
Secretary Zinke, depending how you measure it, I've seen different numbers, but somewhere close to 1 out of every 4 acres of the United States is federal land, a lot of it. And then in addition to that, you have supervision under your department over offshore resources that we have as well. The last administration seemed to try to defer, delay, stall, close off the use of the natural resources on a lot of those federal lands, onshore as well as offshore, at every turn. I sense that there's a new sheriff in town.
There is.
So the question to you and the broader one to this whole administration, can we utilize those natural resources safely without an unreasonable risk to the environment?
Well, yeah, and ultimately, I'm a Boy Scout. You leave your campground in good or better condition than you found it, right? So on the regulatory framework, what you want is to incorporate innovation, best practices, best science, and have stability over the longest term. Is that when a regulatory framework is put in punitively, that is adversarial, then the innovation of industry, and Americans are very clever. We are enormously clever people, and allowing us to innovate is what happened in fracking, in energy, and batteries. America, there's no one more clever than Americans are. So our regulatory framework has to reflect that. The wealth on our public lands, there's a lot of anger out there because they see mismanagement. We just went through a fire season in the West. We spent billions of dollars. There's loss of life because we've forgotten how to manage. And not managing comes at a cost. To having the fuel load and not being able to harvest trees, or not being able to, in a community, some of these communities where I grew up in, sea of trees, communities are dying, and you can't cut a tree. So we're going to change, and we have changed, is you can use the land, the resources, do it in a respectful way. Make sure that when you have a reclamation plan, so when you extract or harvest timber, we do it in the long run using best science. We're great people. Everyone loves our park system. Everyone loves the BLM. Everyone loves to be out there and be able to recreate and use our public lands. But the wealth of those public lands should be accessible. So communities across our country, minerals and oil and gas and wind, all those type of things generate an economy here. And lastly, if you don't have an economy, the rest of it doesn't matter, because you can't afford a strong military if you can't afford to pay for it.
Amen.
And I can tell you, jobs matter. And you look back a year ago, what we have today, the wealth that has been generated through this president, the wealth that's generated from energy, the wealth that's generated from our tax plan, and stand by, because I think we're just getting started.
I think you are too.
Man, yeah.
Secretary Perry, we're about out of time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you another question. President Trump, candidate Trump, promised to end the war on coal, and I know you've taken some steps in that regard. Tell us what's changed, and can coal really be competitive with cheap natural gas and relatively affordable oil? And I also know, if you can take a second, you haven't stopped your effort to support research and development of renewables as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part of this, is for people to understand that this president truly is an all-of-the-above energy policy. Whether it's the renewables, whether it's innovations that we haven't even seen yet, clean coal technologies, the carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, we're exporting that around the world. We're going into India, we're going into China with technologies where they're going to use coal. We want them to use American technology that will allow the use of that in the most environmentally friendly way that it can occur. And we're seeing American LNG. We saw a major reduction in the state of Texas during the 2000s in nitrogen oxide, SOx, the real emissions that affect the environment. We saw a reduction of 20% of CO2 in the 12th largest economy in the world by a transition over to natural gas, getting rid of older, inefficient plants, some other changes, and the greatest growth of wind energy in the United States occurred in my home state during that period of time. They produce more wind energy in Texas today than but 5 countries. That's the type of energy policy that President Trump wants to see. All of the above, where we're using our resources, we're using American innovation, and we're not sitting there and just saying we're going to regulate our way into nirvana, because that is a fallacy.
How about these 2 great cabinet secretaries? Give it up for them. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Well done.